Thank you for that introduction, Eva. I wanted to start my talk today with a question, which is how can we design systems that encourage better cybersecurity behaviors? Now, I think this is an important question because of how, as I'm sure all of us in this room agree, foundational security is to modern computing. Our work, our emails, our money, and the pictures that we share with our friends and loved ones are all ultimately protected or not by the cybersecurity decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis. And yet, typically, when we think about the cybersecurity decisions that most end users are making in most real-world contexts, we're not necessarily thinking about ideal security behaviors. Rather, we typically think about people sharing passwords with their friends and loved ones or propping open electronically locked doors with garbage cans so that it's easier for them to step in and step out. And I say this not to sort of cast shame on those users. I do this myself sometimes. But it does speak to this disconnect between how security systems are designed today and how end users ultimately want to use them. And as a community of researchers, practitioners, and designers, we really need to do better than this. And so in 2014, I decided to interview a few people. I wanted to understand, for example, what makes people use a PIN on their phone or enable two-factor authentication or keep their software updated? Or more generally, what is the driving force behind a security decision and what might we be missing? I want to read you a few quotes from that interview. I started using a PIN because everyone around me had a PIN, so I kind of felt a group pressure to also use a PIN. One of my boys wanted to use my phone, so I gave them my passcode. And not that I have anything I don't care for them to see or anything, but after they did that, I changed it again. My friends have a lot of different accounts, the same as me, but they didn't get into any trouble, so I think maybe it will not be dangerous to reuse passwords in this case. So did anybody notice a trend? A lot of it is social, and in fact, we've known for decades from the social psychology research that a lot of human behavior can be explained by the social influences to which we are exposed, as illustrated by this candid camera clip where the three people facing away from the camera are confederates in a social experiment, and eventually the protagonist will sort of turn around to face the wrong way himself, succumbing to group pressure. Now, security is no exception. Out of the over 100 security behaviors that came up in this interview process, approximately 50% of them turned out to be socially driven in some way, either through an observation of or a conversation with somebody else. And yet traditionally, when we think about the design of these security systems that end users ultimately face, we rarely think about the social dimension. But if my interviews are any indication, absent a more systemic knowledge of the security consequences of social behaviors, as well as the social consequences of security behaviors, we have little hope of doing much better than where we currently are today. So today I want to share with you two projects that I have pursued that sort of try to empirically connect the social with the security. And by the end of it all, I hope to have convinced you of at least the following two things, which is that social influences strongly affect cybersecurity behaviors, and that we can encourage better behaviors by designing more social cybersecurity systems. So let's start with that first one, measuring social influence in security behaviors. Now, of course, the first step in trying to make security more social is to have a better understanding of how social interacts with security already. And I was fortunate enough to partner with Facebook to sort of analyze that question. So what I was able to do was analyze how the use or non-use of 3 optional security tools was affected by one's friend's use of those same security tools for 3 optional security tools that Facebook offered back in 2014. And those were login notifications, which showed you a notification in case there was a suspicious login on your account, login approvals, which is Facebook's version of two-factor authentication, as well as if the first two are sort of the standard security tools that you would expect, Facebook also offered a sort of more social offering, which was trusted contacts, where you could specify 3 to 5 of your friends who could vouch for you in case you ever lost access to your account. So I started by randomly sampling 750,000 users who had newly adopted one of those aforementioned security tools, as well as sort of counterbalance that with 750,000 examples of so-called use-nots who had never adopted one of the aforementioned tools. So that way I could have a snapshot in time of the social networks of the people who newly adopted versus people who had never adopted and compare. So really my question had boiled down to, can I distinguish between who is a user and who is a use-not, so-called, based on the presence of social influence in their networks? And I was able to do that using a technique called match propensity sampling analysis, which is complicated in the details, but pretty simple at the high level. So there are two things to keep in mind. The first is that for each of those security tools, we choose empirically select exposure levels for a particular security tool that can sort of split the population in it too. So for example, for login notifications, we might choose something like 1%, 5%, and 10%. And then you can say something like, if Alice has 6% of her friends who use login notifications, she's exposed at the 5% level. But if she has only 4% of her friends who use login notifications, she is not exposed at that particular level. And so that gives you these two splits of the population, people who do have at least that many friends versus people who do not have at least that many friends who use that tool. And then for each of those exposure levels, we compare the relative adoption rate between those who, quote unquote, are exposed versus those who are not exposed. And this delta in the relative adoption rates, we can call the effect of social influence. Now, of course, if it was just that, it wouldn't be a totally fair comparison, but there is some statistical trickery in the background to make the comparison a little bit more fair. Happy to talk about that more in the discussion if you're curious. But basically, if we sort of boil that down into a graph where the x-axis is the exposure levels I mentioned before, and the y-axis is the difference in adoption rate, or the effect of social influence, if social influence had absolutely no effect, we'd expect to see a flat line at the 0 mark, because that means there's no difference in adoption rate between people who have friends who use the tool and people who do not. More likely, we'd expect to see this nice graph that goes up and to the right, which means that social influence has an effect and it increases as you have more friends who use that particular security tool. It'd be the equivalent of having 10 people in that elevator versus just one person in the elevator facing the wrong direction. So if we plot the results for trusted contacts, we see something that looks very much like what we expect to see. Social influence has a positive effect and and it increases as you have more and more friends who use that particular security tool. And that's really great because that's some of the first empirical evidence that we have that social influence does matter in security and that we should be paying attention to it. But once we start to plot the results for login approvals and login notifications, we get findings that complicate that interpretation a little bit, because that area under the 0 value and the y-axis over there is where social influence actually has a negative effect on the adoption of those particular security tools. And that's really weird and flies in the face of everything that I was expecting going into the work. And so that's the question, right? Like, what is going on there? Well, after talking to some friends in the social sciences about what could possibly explain this effect, it turns out that there might be a term for this. It's called disaffiliation in marketing, or brand disaffiliation. And it happens when an uncool user group starts using your product, right? Like, for example, when parents started using Facebook, teenagers stopped liking it as much as when it was a college-only platform. Now, I want you to really think about the first person in your personal social networks who comes to mind who would use two-factor authentication the first time Facebook offered it. Does that person look anything like this guy? Now, this is of course hyperbole. Not everybody who cares about security is this person. But it is a fact that the first few people who end up using most security tools are people who others might see as a little bit paranoid. They might be more informed. They might be, potentially a little bit ahead of the curve, you might argue. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of people who are not actively in the security space might perceive these early adopters as people not to emulate, people who are a little bit paranoid, a little bit nutty. And that could sort of explain why, despite decades of improvements to the usability of security systems, we still don't really see viral security behavior spread, right? Like, people still primarily kind of not actively want to use security systems. There are a couple of pieces of good news, though. The first is that all these lines go up and to the right, and that means that more exposure is still good. This stigmatic effect of the early adopters of security can be overcome if you have enough people who look more like you who use that particular security system. So we should continue trying to drive adoption up, of course. But the second is that the design of a security tool appears to sort of affect its potential for social spread. Trusted contacts did not have that stigmatic effect. And in speaking with the users and the designers of that particular security tool, I boiled it down to these 3 dimensions of observability, cooperation, and stewardship. Observability encapsulates this idea that when a person uses trusted contacts, at least 3 to 5 of his or her friends immediately gets a notification that they have been specified as a trusted contact. And if they didn't know that that feature existed before, they now come to know about it. When you use login approvals and login notifications, that's a personal decision, and people can only speculate as to who uses these tools or not. And if they're left to their own devices, it could be that they think only the people like the hacking in progress guy use those particular security tools. Cooperation encapsulates this idea that people are working together towards a security end, and then stewardship captures this idea that people can act in benefit of another person's security. Trusted context sort of does well in all of these dimensions, but standard security tools like two-factor and login notifications typically don't really keep these dimensions in mind. So it might be that by making security a little bit more observable, cooperative, and stewarded, we can get more security tools that have that nice curve that trusted contacts did, as opposed to this sort of curve that login notifications and login approvals did. Okay, so next, I wanted to sort of figure out how can we use this information to actually improve the awareness and adoption of existing security systems. And it might be difficult to make login approvals and login notifications more cooperative and stewarded right away, but you can certainly make it more observable by showing people notifications of how many of their friends use a particular security tool. And so I wanted to test that hypothesis with a randomized experiment with 50,000 Facebook users. Now, the premise of the experiment was very simple. We just showed people a little notification on top of their Facebook news feeds that alerted them to the fact that additional security tools existed to protect their account. The vanilla non-social control notification I used was this one that just said, you can use security settings to protect your account and make sure it can be recovered if you ever lose access, and provided users with a sort of call to action button they could click on to enable those and learn more about those particular security tools. I also tested 7 variations of social proof, ranging from the raw number condition, where I showed people the number of their friends who used those security tools, to the sum condition, which only alerted people to a vague notion that some of their friends used extra security settings. So in total in this experiment, we had 8 conditions, the 7 social and the 1 non-social control, and we randomly assigned our 50,000 participants to each of these 8 conditions and ran the experiment for about 3 days. And then we measured the click-through rate on the announcements, and as well as the adoptions of one of the promoted security tools within 7 days and 5 months after we ran the experiment to evaluate the effectiveness of these different notifications. Now, here's what those numbers look like aggregated across all conditions. About 93% of the sample logged in and saw one of the announcements. 13% clicked on an announcement. 4% adopted one of the promoted security tools within 7 days. And then finally, about 10% adopted one of the promoted tools within a 5-month period. Now, here's what those numbers look like broken down across condition. And there are 2 quick things that I want you to take away from this slide. The first is that every single social condition significantly outperformed the non-social control condition in soliciting more clicks on the announcement, so people were more likely to even pay attention and explore additional security tools. And the best 2 performing social conditions even got more people to ultimately adopt one of the promoted security tools. So specifically, the raw number condition did best, and it got about 36% more clicks and about 10% more adoptions than the non-social control, which is pretty amazing when you think about the fact that the only thing that I really changed in this particular condition was that first sentence in a small notification on top of the Facebook newsfeed. So I'm really just scratching the surface of what might be possible with social proof here. This is, the smallest possible change I could have made to possibly test this hypothesis. So it does appear that making cybersecurity systems more social can encourage better cybersecurity behaviors, but I've really just scratched the surface. Remember that I started this talk with this question of how can we design systems that encourage better cybersecurity behaviors? Well, if we look at sort of the work that I presented today and with respect to that, answering that question, it appears that there's this fruitful but largely untapped opportunity to improve cybersecurity behaviors by making systems that emphasize these dimensions of observability, cooperation, and stewardship. But what might that look like? Well, if we think about observability, I really mean engaging with this question of how can we make it easier to observe and emulate good cybersecurity behaviors. Now, when you think about it, in the virtual world, we're kind of stuck in a fog of war. We can't really see the threats that are coming towards us until they're right in front of our faces. and we can't see what anybody else is doing to protect themselves against those threats. So it's not really too much of a surprise that oftentimes security attacks totally blindside us, because it's just really difficult for us to see it coming, even if some subset of the population has deep knowledge about that particular phenomenon. So how can we create these systems that make it easier for sort of viral social behavior spread, or make it easy for people who may know a little bit less about security to observe and emulate good behaviors? When I talk about designing systems that are meant to be a little bit more cooperative, I mean, how can we design additive security systems that make group security more of a sum function than a min function? So when you think about in the physical world, if we use that as an analog, if I'm walking down a dark alleyway alone at night versus with a friend, I feel safer when I'm with a friend because our strength aggregates. I know an attacker has to sort of overcome the both of us if the attack is to be successful. But when you think about the equivalent sort of scenario in the virtual world, that's not really the case. If I'm sharing confidential information with a friend who might have weaker security behaviors, then guess what? An attacker's easiest route to get my confidential information is through that friend. And so when you sort of aggregate in the virtual world, group security becomes a min function as opposed to a sum function, when really it should be working the other way around. At least it should be a max function so that somebody interacting with an expert security practitioner or somebody who has good security behaviors can benefit from that interaction instead of not benefit in any way. And then finally, by making security systems more stewarded, I mean engaging with this question of how can we design systems that allow people to act on their concern for the security of their loved ones? I can know that a big security breach happened to company X, and I can know that I have many friends who use the services of company X, but there's not much that I can do short of calling them up and nagging and identifying myself as one of these tinfoil hat people. Yet in my interviews and in sort of in my research in general, it's come up multiple times that people might be more concerned for the security of their friends and loved ones than they are for themselves. For themselves, they might think, well, I don't really care particularly about two-factor authentication for my email. I just want to get in as quickly as possible. But when you ask the same question about do they feel the same way about what their friends should do or what their parents should do, they always say, no, they should probably use two-factor authentication. So right now, this energy is totally wasted. We don't harness it in any way. So we need to do better at creating these tools that can harness our concern for each other and allow people to sort of act in sort of useful ways towards the benefit of other people. But even if you disagree with pretty much all of those design dimensions that I talked about, and certainly there's some room for interpretation there, I think that if, as a community, we can keep in mind this one key point that social influences strongly affect cybersecurity behaviors, and that we can encourage better behaviors by designing more social cybersecurity systems, I think we're in good shape as we move forward to sort of improve the state of where we are today. So that's my talk. I'm Sauvik again from Georgia Tech, and I'm happy to engage in any questions.